we need to talk about the elephant in the room. No, not that elephant. Hey everyone, I'm Belle Reid, and today I'm talking about the S-4 Sculpting Sampler from Torso Electronics. The S-4 is a sampler and multi-effect processor with a built-in granular processor, resonator, distortion effects like bit crushing and overdrive, and spatial effects like reverb and delay. You can record into the S-4 and manipulate the playback of your samples in a tape music-inspired workflow, or you can process incoming sounds in real time. But wait, what about the elephant in the room? Okay, let me explain. When the S-4 was originally released, early adopters of the instrument found a number of bugs. Plus, certain hardware features weren't yet implemented. So if you search for the S-4 online, you might find negative reviews and comments about the fact that certain buttons on the instrument don't do anything yet except display a "coming soon" banner. And that's true. That said, I've been using the S-4 in a lot of my music over the last 5 or 6 months, and I've been getting a lot of questions from people about how I use it, whether or not I like it, and generally just how it fits into my workflow. So I wanted to make a video about it to share some of my thoughts. Torso sent me an early S-4 unit to check out, but they had no input on this video. These are my honest opinions after using the instrument for a few months. So over the time that I've had the S-4, there have been a number of firmware updates, fixing bugs and improving various features. And in my experience, the instrument is much more stable than early reviews and online commentary suggest. As of the filming of this video in November 2024, there are still some features that aren't implemented, such as the perform and scene buttons. But given the attention that Torso has given to the updates these last several months, I don't doubt that these features will come in time. So I would absolutely understand if that's just not something that you want to deal with, but I personally have still been getting a lot out of the S-4, even with the feature set as it currently is. To me personally, it doesn't feel like an incomplete instrument. And given everything that it has to offer, I'm personally happy to meet it on its own terms. While I'm obviously really interested to see what the future features might be like, I personally feel like the S-4 is a really unique and really fun instrument, even in its current state. All right, so a lot of the music that I've heard that uses the S-4 so far is ambient, atmospheric music, and it's beautiful, but I personally really wanted to see what else this device was capable of doing. I have always dreamt of having a kind of like sonic blender of sorts, where I can put in a bunch of different sounds and have it chop up and swirl them around and give me back something that is entirely different from what I put in. So I really wanted to see how far I could push the S-4 and what kind of strange new sound worlds we could get to. For this video today, I'm going to start off with a brief overview of the S-4, everything that is included and how it works. And then I will share a bunch of different demos and examples of how I've been using it as an experimental sound design tool in my own music. If you want to pick up an S-4 for yourself, there's an affiliate link in the description below this video that you can use. All right, let's get started. The S-4 is a 4-track sampler. Each of its 4 tracks use an identical signal path, but each track is fully independent of the others. The signal path on each track is composed of a number of different modules or devices for manipulating and processing sounds. So let's take a look at each of them in turn. Sound starts in this first device, which is called Material. You can either load a sample in here from the sample library, record a new sample, or run an external instrument or sound source in for live processing. There are a couple of different modes for the material device. There's tape, which emulates the workflow of traditional tape music. In this mode, you can change the playback start and end points, the playback speed, the direction of the sample, and so on. And then you have poly, which turns the S4 into an 8-voice polyphonic sample player that you can pair with an external sequencer or MIDI controller. We're going to take a look at this in action later on. And finally, there's a bypass mode, which simply passes the audio through to the next device in the signal chain. There's a built-in microphone here on the S4 that you can use for recording, and you also have 2 1/4-inch inputs here as well. The built-in microphone isn't the best quality imaginable, but it still gives you valuable material for sample manipulation. It has an interesting lo-fi character, and when you have it turned on, it actually turns the entire instrument into a kind of amplified surface. So even gentle finger taps on the keys and the sound of turning encoders can turn into pretty interesting sample material. So to start off, I'm going to record a little bit of sound using the built-in mic. And now that we've recorded something, we can trim it by adjusting the start time and the length of the sample. And we can also adjust the speed and tempo of the sample. So by default, the S4 uses a global metronome, and it tempo syncs everything to the global BPM, which can be very handy if you want to use the S4 for more rhythmic music. In this mode, you can alter the BPM of the recorded sample, and you can change the playback speed, but you're limited to divisions or multiplications of the S4's BPM. So you can make it play twice as fast or an octave higher, 4 times as fast, and 2 octaves higher, and so on. If you want to have more freedom in terms of playback speed and pitch, you can click and turn the tempo encoder to switch between sync and free mode. When you're in free mode, the playback speed control has a lot more options. You can freely move up and down by semitones, or you can choose a quantized scale option by clicking and turning the speed encoder. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom of this list, you can also set the speed encoder to free, which removes all pitch quantization. There's also a control here called X-Fade to allow a crossfade at the loop start and end points to help smooth out any clicks in the loop. There's also an overdub button, which allows you to record new material into the same buffer, and a sound on sound control, which controls how much original material is re-recorded into the buffer with a new overdub. And finally, there are some alt functions that you can access by pressing Control, such as the ability to reverse the sample, which changes the direction of the playback, and a freeze control, which latches a very small portion of audio. From here, sound passes into the second device on the S4, which is called Mosaic. This is a granular processor that allows you to break the incoming sound into many little pieces or grains of audio and perform time warping, pitch shifting, and some other interesting textural effects. Note that this is a live granular processor that constantly samples its input, so it always processes sound coming out of the material device. So there is a pitch control that alters the pitch and playback speed of the grains. Here again, you are able to choose a quantized scale, or you can set the pitch parameter to free if you would prefer. There's a rate control, which determines the rate of new grains. These can be tempo synced to the global BPM, or they can be free. The size control alters the grain size, and contour changes the shape of an envelope that is applied to the loudness of new grains. Turning it to the left will give new grains a sharp attack and a longer decay. To the right will make them swell in and suddenly decay, and in the middle will create a smoother envelope. Warp, spray, and pattern are all different ways of applying internal modulation to the grains. Warp modulates the playhead position, spray introduces randomization of the grain position in the stereo field, and pattern modulates the grain pitch. You can also apply randomness to the primary granular parameters by going to the second page of controls. Detune applies randomness to the grain pitch, and you can also apply per grain randomness to either the rate or size of new grains, which can be really interesting. There are more modulation capabilities available in the S4, but I'll come back to those in just a minute. So again, just like in the material device, all of these different devices also have a bypass mode, which you can select if you'd prefer to simply send your sound through to the next module in the signal chain. Okay, so next up, the sound moves into the filter device. The filter that's built into the S4 is a bit different from more traditional high-pass or low-pass filters that you commonly encounter in synthesizers. At its core, this filter is a 48-band resonator with a number of different tools available that make it possible to manipulate and animate the spectral profile of your incoming sound. There's also a second state variable filter that you can use either before or after the resonator. So the cutoff, resonance, and slope controls are all fairly typical filter controls that control the state variable filter. Cutoff lets you determine the cutoff frequency of the filter. It defaults to low pass mode, but using the slope control, you can morph from low pass through band pass and up to high pass response. And the resonance controls the resonance or the Q of the filter. Decay, pitch, and scale are all controls that correspond to the resonator. Decay impacts the resonance or ring time of the individual filter bands, which, when turned up, can create some really interesting resonant bell-like tones. Pitch controls the pitch of the individual bands, and scale allows you to quantize the individual bands to a specific scale. On page 2 of the filter device, there are a number of modulation controls. Waves applies a smooth LFO modulation to the frequency bands, and Waves R controls the speed of that modulation. And finally, Noise introduces random modulation of the amplitude of each of the filter bands, and Noise R controls the speed of that randomization. Tilt and detune are both different ways to alter the individual tuning and frequency response of each band to access a range of spectral color and variation. The fourth device here in the signal chain is the color device. This focuses on distortion effects such as overdrive, bit crushing, adding noise, and it also has a compressor. And finally, sound passes into the last device here in the signal chain, which is the space device. This has a delay and a reverb. You have controls for the amount of delay and the delay time, which again can be synced to the global BPM or set to free, the feedback amount, as well as the amount of reverb, the room size for the reverb decay time, and the damping amount, which is a low pass filter applied to both delay and reverb feedback. Okay, awesome. So remember that everything that we've just looked at is the structure of a single track. And we have 4 tracks on the S4 that each have these 5 devices and can each be configured independently of one another. Even spatial effects like delay and reverb are independent per track rather than being global, which really encourages using them as sound design tools more so than as typical set and forget end of chain effects. There is a master mixer where you can adjust the levels of all 4 of your tracks, apply global compression to all 4 tracks, and apply individual per track filtering and panning. As I mentioned briefly earlier, there are also a number of modulation controls available that can be arbitrarily mapped to different parameters of these various devices. Each track of the S-4 has 4 modulation slots. You can assign each slot a modulation source and then map that to 1 or more destinations. So to set up modulation, the first thing you want to do is choose your modulation source. So I'm going to press and hold the modulation button here and then choose which of the 4 modulation slots I want to work with. I will do modulation slot number 1. And now I can choose what type of modulation source I want to use. The 4 modulation sources can be set individually to wave, random, or ADSR modes. Each of these modes gives you a variety of different controls for altering their shape and speed. Wave is an LFO with a number of controls for altering wave shape. You can skew the higher amplitude portions of the wave toward the beginning or end of the cycle. You can apply exponential or logarithmic amplitude scaling using the curve control here. And you can use the fold control to create more complex modulation shapes. Offset applies a bias to the waveform, and you also have continuous phase adjustment as well. One of the more interesting parameters here is the spread control, which allows you to create 2 phase-shifted copies of the LFO, which affect the left and right audio channels respectively. All right, so let's actually listen to this LFO shape applied to a modulation destination. So I'll hit the mod button one more time, and this puts us into the modulation mapping mode. And now all of these knobs here turn into modulation depth controls for the various parameters. So for example, I could turn up the amount of impact that this LFO has on the speed here of our sample. Let's take a listen to that. We could also try modulating the length. Random is a stepped random modulation source that can act either as a fixed random pattern that repeats over and over again, or as a more typical, constantly evolving random shape. So I'm going to start here with variation turned down, which means that this random shape will be the same every time through. It will just repeat over and over again. And I'm going to apply this modulation to the speed of the sample playback. The length control lets you adjust the length of the random pattern. So when you use this like a sequencer, you can think of this as a sequence length control. And then if we turn up the variation amount, this is going to act more like a true stepped random. The smooth control allows you to morph between stepped and smooth randomness. And just like we saw in the wave mode, you also have controls for phase, offset, and spread. So by turning up the spread control here, we're going to get 2 stepped random patterns that are out of phase with one another. So we'll hear different pitches on the left and right side. And finally, ADSR mode is an envelope with controls for attack, decay, sustain, and release, as well as controls for the curve of the attack, decay, and release stages. So I'll set up this modulation source to modulate the cutoff of our filter. I'll go ahead and turn that up, and then I will turn the cutoff down on the filter. So now I can manually trigger this envelope here using this trig key. And we can hear the filter opening and closing in the shape of the envelope. You can also use an external MIDI controller to trigger the ADSR modulation source. All right, awesome. So now that we have a lay of the land here with the S4, I want to use the rest of this video to share some more fleshed out musical demos and examples of how I've been using the S4 in combination with different acoustic sound sources, synthesizers, and MIDI controllers. So for this example, I am running my Eurorack modular synth into the S4, and I have bypassed the first device. So I am sending the sound from the Eurorack live directly into the Mosaic Granular processor. The only other part of the S4 that I'm using for this patch is here. I have dialed up just a little bit of compression on this track as well. So for this demo, I have 3 different tracks of audio set up on the S4, and they're all using the same sample that was recorded from Strega. For the first 2 tracks, I have them set up in poly mode here, and I'm using the keystep MIDI controller to trigger the first 2 tracks polyphonically. They are both set up to receive MIDI information on the same MIDI channel, but both the first and second tracks have different offsets dialed in terms of the pitch, the playback of the sample, and they have different envelope shapes. So what this means is that with each key press, we will hear both of the tracks simultaneously, but we will hear the material played back at different pitches and with different dynamic profiles. And on track 3, I have the sample set up here in the regular tape mode. It's running through the granular processor and producing a high shimmery tone. So for this example, I am using the KeyStep MIDI controller to send MIDI over to the IntelliGel Cascadia. And then I'm running the sound from the synth into the S4 for live processing. I'm using 2 random modulation sources from the S4 here to modulate different parameters of the granular processor. For this demo, I am running a microphone into the input here on the S4 in order to process it live. I'm doing a little bit of pitch modulation with the granular processor, and I'm also applying some delay and reverb. In this demo, I have 3 separate tracks of audio. On the first 2 tracks, I'm using samples of trumpet and also my voice. And on the third track, I also have a sample of my voice making more kind of percussive, clicky, breathy noises. I have tracks 1 and 2 set up in poly mode, and I'm going to be playing them using this keyboard. And track 3 is set up in tape mode. So I don't know about you, but I think that the S-4 is really cool. I feel like the built-in modulation and the MIDI control turns this into a super versatile and dynamic instrument that can completely transform whatever sound you put into it. I also feel like it can function really well as part of a live performance setup to create layers and harmonies and to do all kinds of live processing. I've been using the S4 a lot in my personal music lately as an effects processor and also as a way of generating new material for compositions. For example, something I've been doing is sampling a percussive pattern from a synth and then bringing it into the S4, manipulating it, and taking that sample back into my DAW, further manipulating it, chopping it up, and maybe even reprocessing it a second time through the S4. I'm looking forward to seeing how Torso continues to develop the S4, and I know that personally it will continue to make an appearance in my creative work. Just a reminder that there are affiliate links in the description below this video, so if you'd like to pick up an S4 for yourself, you can use those to do so. And anything that you buy using those links helps to support my channel at no extra cost to you, so I can continue making videos like this one. And finally, if you're interested in joining an amazing community of people who are passionate about things like experimental music and sound design, or if you're interested in things like behind the scenes content and unreleased music, then I would like to invite you to check out and possibly join my Patreon community. You can learn more by going to patreon.com/Sarah Belle Reid. Okay, that's it for today. As always, thank you so much for watching and for listening. I'll see you next time. Elephant. This hopefully won't create feedback. And it will. LOL. I have a little piece of my avocado toast in my hand, but I'm going to do a slate. Oh, I just dropped seeds everywhere. Sarah, get your shit together. Okay, I'm going to start over again.